Hello there, Homeschool Nolan here to help you navigate learning in the digital age. He went to China. It was 50 years ago this month when President Richard Nixon made his historic visit to the People's Republic of China. Nixon called it the week that changed the world. Well, given how both China and the United States have evolved since then, that might have been an understatement. And today, I'd like to take a look back on that historic trip and share some thoughts on what President Nixon's historic trip to China 50 years ago still means today. But first, China has certainly been in the news a lot this past year. It's hard to turn on the news these days and not see a story about China. And it's hard to look around at our local Walmart store or even in our own home and not find a product that was made in China. China's influence, both direct and indirect, seems to be everywhere now. But that wasn't the case back in 1972. In 1972, China had been isolated and closed off from the United States and much of the Western world since 1949. The United States didn't even recognize the government of the People's Republic of China. It instead recognized Chiang Kai-shek's government on Taiwan. The announcement of President Nixon's visit to China sparked a lot of curiosity and mystery as to what China really looked like. My father bought his very first color TV set in 1972 because he was anxious to see what China looked like. The visit to China was the first major world event that was broadcast live on color TV, and the Chinese government and the Nixon administration didn't disappoint. It started with Nixon's dramatic arrival and his handshake with Premier Zhou Enlai at Peking Airport. This was followed by carefully staged visits to the Great Wall, the Ming Tombs, the Forbidden City, and then speeches at the Great Hall of the People. Nixon, the master politician, skillfully used his visit as part of his re-election campaign that year. Now, the conventional view has been that the trip to China was the product of Richard Nixon's foreign policy genius, in that it was Nixon who had the strategic foresight and wisdom to reach out to the world's most populous communist country. It was often said that because of his strong anti-communist credentials, that only Nixon could go to China. But we now know from Henry Kissinger, who was Nixon's national security advisor, through his book on China, that leaders in China, not just in the United States, were just as responsible for initiating the reconciliation between the two countries. You see, by the 1960s, relations between China and their former close ally, the Soviet Union, had deteriorated. There were frequent border clashes between the two big countries, and China was genuinely worried about a real war with the Soviet Union. So in 1969, Mao Zedong tapped 4 marshals from the People's Liberation Army to reassess China's relations with both the Soviet Union and the United States. China at the time viewed both their communist neighbor up north and the imperialist United States as threats to China. But the 4 marshals concluded that engagement with the United States was in their best interest, as they feared a more likely war with the Soviet Union. It's also important to note that China's economy at the time was still in shambles, with millions of Chinese living under extreme poverty. It makes sense now, with the hindsight of 50 years, that China should have naturally decided to reach out to the United States so they could perhaps work with and learn from the world's richest country in building their own economy. Mao Zedong probably never envisioned China becoming the economic superpower that it is today. But the Chinese do think long term. And looking back, it certainly does look like China's decision to turn away from the Soviet Union and towards the United States has paid off huge long-term dividends as China has grown into an economic superpower. And looking back, it appears that the gains for Nixon and the United States were more short-term. The visit to China was a tremendous television success, and it helped propel Nixon to a landslide re-election victory in 1972. But unfortunately for Nixon, he had to resign from the presidency just 2 years later in 1974 over the Watergate scandal. That said, I believe history will remember him most for his opening to China. But what does Nixon's trip to China mean for us today, 50 years later? If you follow the news, you may notice that relations between the United States and China aren't so great right now. In fact, they're probably the worst it's ever been since before 1972. And that's why Nixon's trip to China can offer some important perspective for us today. In 1972, not only did the United States not even recognize the People's Republic of China, but the countries had also fought against each other earlier during the Korean War of the 1950s. The People's Republic of China viewed Americans as imperialists who threatened their country, and Americans viewed China as part of a global communist threat against freedom. Yet despite their differences, they still managed to find enough common ground to come together in 1972. In his first meeting with Chairman Mao, President Nixon said something interesting. He said, quote, "We know China doesn't threaten the territory of the United States. I think you know the United States has no territorial designs on China. We know China doesn't want to dominate the United States. We believe you too realize that the United States doesn't want to dominate the world. Also, or maybe you don't believe this, but I do, neither China nor the United States, both great nations, want to dominate the world. Because our attitudes are the same on these issues, we don't threaten each other's territories. Therefore, we can find common ground despite our differences, to build a world structure in which both can be safe to develop in our own way on our own roads. That cannot be said about some other nations of the world." I found those remarks interesting because 50 years later, we find both countries accusing the other of wanting to dominate the world. But at the same time, both countries have become increasingly economically dependent on each other. Neither country can easily decouple from the other without severe consequences. But perhaps it is this interdependency where the countries can still find a common ground despite their differences, to build a world structure safe for everyone. If you're interested in learning more about Nixon's historic trip to China, I recommend you check out a video on YouTube put out by the Richard Nixon Presidential Library called Nixon in China. I put a link to it below. In this video, you can see a lot of the original footage that was broadcasted from China in 1972. It's quite fascinating to see what China looked like in 1972 and compare it to today. If current trends continue, I believe our children will grow up in a world increasingly dominated by both China and the United States. Perhaps exploring the past can help the next generation shape a better future. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to click subscribe. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.